The first snow came early that year, with a wind that slapped like a drunk father and scraped its way between every board in every settler's cabin, except one. It wasn't the largest cabin. It wasn't the prettiest. Hell, most of the town didn't even call it a cabin anymore. They called it the box in a box, or the shack with a skirt, or that widow's damn fool porch wall. Folks smirked and snorted and tilted their hats when they walked past it, pretending not to see the nailed-up beams and plank sheds built flush around all four sides. But when January rolled in like death itself, they stopped laughing. Because while their babies coughed blood and frost claimed the youngest, the widow's cabin sat still and warm like a womb. Her name was Ada Grieves. She was barely 23, with milk still drying in her gown and a baby too small for a name when the first freeze cracked the troughs. She deburied her husband Levi 6 weeks after the birth. Fever took him quick. He was a carpenter and mule breeder, one of the good ones, the kind that could split a beam smooth with just a hatchet and 2 nails. He never raised a hand, never missed a Sunday, and built that cabin from river pine with his own back. And then he died in 3 days flat. Most would have gone back east. Ada had no kin in these parts, just the grave, a baby with colic, and a roof made for Arkansas summers, not Dakota winters. The only thing between her and the wind was that roof, and by November it was already weeping frost. That's when she started building. It wasn't graceful, wasn't symmetrical. It was 4 sheds, or more like lean-tos, slapped up against each wall of her cabin. No doors, no windows, just boards, tar, and pitch nailed shut around the house like a second skin. She used scavenged barn planks and sawmill rejects, anything that wouldn't freeze. The men shook their heads when they rode past. "She's wallin' herself in like a damn chicken coop," one said. "Might as well be burying herself with that kid," said another. But inside, it was quiet. The wind came and the wind passed. The real cold never reached the first wall. And that was the trick. No one noticed at first. Through November and early December they still mocked her. When the preacher's wife brought old quilts to the Granger family, she didn't stop at Ada's. "If you're too proud to beg, you'll be too proud to freeze," someone muttered on Christmas Eve when Ada declined their firewood. But she wasn't proud. She just knew something they didn't. Because Ada hadn't always lived on the prairie. She'd grown up in the coal hills of southern Illinois, where old Welsh miners buried their homes halfway into the rock, where chimneys were vent pipes and you felt the earth's warmth even when the snow came 2 feet deep. Her daddy had been a quarryman. Her ma once built a clay stove that ran off coal dust and chicken fat, and Ada remembered every brick. And she remembered what her father told her the night her baby was born, just weeks before he left for work in a different state and never came back. "2 walls are better than 1, honey. Even a dead fire breathes if you keep it wrapped up right." So when the baby came early and the fever took Levi, and the first wind blew sharp enough to draw blood, Ada didn't weep. She pulled her skirts up, tied her boots tight, and started hauling lumber. The shed walls went up slowly. She had to strap the baby to her back. Every nail was precious. She reused iron from Levi's mule cart and stripped hinges off the cellar doors. The settlers laughed harder when they saw her out there hammering in sleet. One woman called it a nesting instinct gone mad. But Ada knew what she was doing. She wasn't building for looks. She was building for insulation. Each wall trapped a layer of air. Each layer slowed the wind. The sheds didn't hold heat, but they stopped the cold. And inside the main cabin, she built a second ceiling, low and curved like a half barrel. Hung quilts under the rafters. Moved her bed near the stove, and then, her final act, dug a shallow trench beneath the cabin and filled it with coals during the day, banking them under iron grates to keep warm air seeping up through the floorboards. The baby stopped crying at night. That's when people started noticing. January came. It came angry. It came with wolves clawing their way down from the high ridges. It came with 2 infants dead before New Year's, lungs frozen solid before dawn. The Grangers lost a boy. The Eckers buried twins. The preacher's wife burned the church pews just to keep her stove lit. And yet Ada's chimney kept smoking. There were no screams from her cabin, no red cheeks or frostbitten toes. When the sheriff rode out to check, expecting to find the widow stiff as a board with the baby curled dead on her breast, he knocked and found her humming. She cracked the door just enough to let out a glow of warmth that hit him in the face like a stove flap. Inside, the air was still. A faint smell of pitch and herbs hung in the warmth. The baby blinked up from a sling by the stove. His cheeks were plump, his fingers pink. "You all right?" the sheriff asked. Ada nodded. "We're warm." That was all she said. By late January, they weren't mocking her anymore. They were knocking on her door. First came the Granger girl, 17 and blue-lipped. Her father had died hauling firewood, and she'd found her mother frozen with her hand on the latch. Ada let her in, no questions asked. Gave her the warm cot, the broth, the only dry blanket she had. Then came the preacher's boy. Then a mother and her toddler. By mid-February, Ada's cabin had 7 souls and 1 fire, and the shed still held. That's when the real crisis began, not outside but inside, because every extra breath threatened to drain what warmth was left, and the more people she saved, the more mouths needed heat. And Ada started to feel it. In her bones. In her blood. She was still nursing her baby, still mending seams and boiling broth, but the fatigue crept in like a second winter, worse than the first. Because she'd built her second walls to hold out the cold, she hadn't thought they'd have to hold in the lives of a whole town. But she didn't stop. Not even when the stove went out, and the last bundle of kindling turned to ash. Not even when her fingers split from hauling snowmelt. She remembered her daddy's voice. Even a dead fire breathes. And in the night, when the storm howled, and she felt the air turn against them, she crawled out into the freezing dark with a sack of hot bricks and buried them under the cabin floor. She sealed every seam with pine sap and wet cloth. She pressed her own body over the baby's cradle like a shield. And when dawn came, the chimney smoked again. The town never laughed after that. They came in silence with gifts, a bag of flour, a spool of thread, a pot of rendered fat. They called her Mrs. Grieves with a reverence that hadn't been there before. They never asked how she did it. They just knew that somehow her useless sheds had saved more lives than all their money, muscle, or pride. And Ada, she just went on rocking her baby quietly in a house that never felt the wind. By mid-February, Ada Grieves' cabin had become more than shelter. It was a furnace of quiet mercy in a valley nearly stripped bare of hope. But mercy runs lean when stretched too far, and Ada was learning, hour by hour, that survival carried weight not only in the body but in the soul. The baby was still healthy, impossibly so. Red-cheeked and plump-limbed, he napped soundly between feedings while the others huddled near the stove, their eyes sunken with cold and dread. The cabin's warmth was no miracle. It was a system of walls and seals and heated stones, of bodies clustered together at night like pups in a den, of old instincts brought back from the cold towns of Ada's girlhood. But the real structure was Ada herself, bone-tired, half-fed, swaying on her feet but unwilling to fall. There was a rule in her house now. No one opens the main door, not for breath, not for smoke, not even to pray. All smoke was vented through an iron pipe she'd sealed herself, with rags and clay and a single copper band from Levi's saddle. It ran hot to the roofline, and she checked it every morning, sometimes with a baby on her hip and a poker in the other hand. She didn't trust the settlers to keep it safe. She trusted herself. Trusting others, especially the ones who'd laughed, wasn't a luxury she could afford. Yet they kept coming. Not in droves, not with tears or begging, just small, desperate steps. A woman with split heels and 3 boys behind her, an old miner missing fingers, a father whose wagon burned when his wife tried to warm the baby with oil-soaked rags, By March, 9 people shared Ada's home. 9. And 1 infant. The cabin had been built for 2, maybe 3 in a pinch. The original structure was little more than a square, 10 feet by 10 feet, a stove near the middle, 1 bed, 1 shelf, and a wall peg for tools. But with the outer sheds enclosing it, flush on all 4 sides, it became something else entirely. An inner sanctum. Each shed trapped still air, which in turn trapped the warmth. The outer door now led to a shed room, not the wind. Then another, then finally the main chamber, like passing through concentric lungs. And each lung was filled with people. Ada rationed heat with military precision. The stove was always fed by hand, never more than 2 splits at a time. She'd watch it, crouched like a cat, measuring how fast the flame climbed, how hot the pipe became. If it grew too fast, she'd tamp it. If too slow, she'd feed in a pinch of fat or twist of dried sage. Her sense of temperature had become uncanny. She could feel it shift in a room by a single breath. But the human side, the people, that was harder. They meant well, they helped when they could. Someone whittled pegs for drying cloth. Another taught the children to knit booties from frayed rope. But there were tensions, always. The Granger girl flinched at sudden movements. The old miner muttered in his sleep. The preacher's boy was too quiet, too withdrawn, and once Ada caught him staring not at her, but at her baby with a look of blank, unbearable hunger, not for food, for warmth, for something he could never have again. And that terrified her more than the frost. She stopped sleeping. At least not all the way. She would rest in shifts, one ear always listening, one hand always on the baby's blanket. She kept her back to the wall, her eyes on the stove. Her own skin had turned pale and hollow. Her breasts dried early, so she mashed cornmeal in snow and let it ferment in a jar on the stove-warm shelf, creating a bitter paste the baby took grudgingly. It kept him alive. Barely. And in the long hours between the howling wind and the half-dreams of her husband's voice, Ada began to feel the edges of something she'd never known before. Not madness. No, she was too clear-headed for that. It was something older, sharper. The thing that lives in mothers when they see a wolf across the field or a storm on the horizon and know, without words, that the line between life and death has narrowed to a breath. She became that line. It was during a week-long snowburst, when the drifts sealed even the outhouses and the last pine logs were burned to charcoal, that the worst test came. The miner collapsed. His cough had worsened for days, a hollow rattle that shook the walls. Ada had tried pine needle tea, mustard plasters, even heated bricks wrapped in lardcloth, but he only weakened. And on the 4th morning he didn't rise. The others were silent. No one wanted to say it. Ada was the only one who touched him, who pressed her hand to his forehead and felt the truth. Dead. But she said nothing. She waited until the others were dozing, then dragged his body into the farthest shed room. She wrapped him in blankets, sealed the doorway, and whispered a prayer. She couldn't risk burying him. The ground was rock, and the air would freeze her lungs before the first shovelful, so she did the unthinkable. She left him there. And she built another wall. Not of lumber, she had none left, but of cloth and bedding and anything thick enough to press into a barrier. She made it 3 layers deep and told the others that the room was too cold to use. No one questioned it. But from then on she could feel it, the presence, like a pressure in the air, like the cold had found a way inside. And the baby started to cry. Not at first, just whimpers, a restless twitching, then full-throated screams nights in a row. Ada tried everything, held him, sang to him, changed his wrappings twice an hour, nothing helped. Until she remembered the one thing that had always worked, movement. So she strapped him to her chest and began to walk. Circles, hours, from shed room to wall, around the stove, back again. Step after step, the cabin moving under her feet like a slow dance in a world turned to ice. And the baby calmed. And Ada endured. But the others were starting to falter. A woman passed out near the stove. A child soiled herself and lay curled in a pile of rags. One night, someone tried to break into the food shelf. Ada found the latch twisted, the cloth peeled back. She said nothing. She just moved the food under her cot, slept with one hand on it, and began locking the outermost shed door with the last piece of iron she had, an old mule bit from Levi's kit. No one left after that. No one came either. The town was sealed under snow. No smoke curled from chimneys. No horses passed, and the silence outside grew heavier than the cries within. Ada began to wonder if spring would ever come. Then one night a sound. Not wind, not a cough. Knocking. Hard and panicked, like fists slamming into the outer wall. She froze. No one else moved. The baby stirred, whimpered, then fell quiet. The knocking came again. And then a voice. Ada, Ada Grieves, are you alive in there? She recognized it. Will Tanner's, a ranch hand who lived a mile out, known more for whiskey than wisdom. She hadn't seen him since Levi's funeral. The snow had buried his cabin early. Folks assumed he'd fled or froze. She unbolted the outer door, one layer at a time. The wind screamed in, but so did Will, half frozen, wild-eyed, dragging something behind him. A girl, barely breathing. I found her, he gasped. Only survivor up the ridge, her folks' ice. She crawled out. I didn't know where else to go. Ada said nothing, just pulled them in, sealed the door, and went to work. They survived the night. And the next. And the one after that. Ada used every trick she knew, salted rags, boiling snow over coals, splitting broth into thimble doses for the girl's cracked lips. And slowly, impossibly, the child stirred. Will wept when he saw her open her eyes. And Ada. She smiled. For the first time since Levi died. The thaw came in April, late and slow, but it came. One by one, the cabin's doors opened. One by one, the people inside stepped into a world reborn in mud and melt. Some limped, some cried, all stared at the trees like they'd never seen green before. And the town. It had changed. Nearly half were gone. Some cabins caved in. Some stood dark and empty. But the name that passed every lip now was Ada Grieves. Not the widow. Not the crazy shed woman. Just Ada. The woman whose baby never felt the winter. By the time the snow finally let go its grip, the valley looked nothing like the place it had been in the fall. The spring thaw revealed the bones of the winter, literal and otherwise. Trees that had split under the weight of ice now leaned like drunks. Fences bowed or lay flat, their posts gnawed by wind and time. Chickens wandered wild, feral, and half-starved. Barn doors hung open to the sky. There were no animals in the pastures, no plumes from the blacksmith's forge. Just silence, mud, and melted sorrow. Yet at the far end of the valley, past the scattered cabins and frost-burned fields, one house stood like it had been braced by the earth itself. Ada Grieves' cabin. 4 sides still ringed by rough lean-tos. Roof black with soot, wood scorched in places from heat too close for safety. But it stood. And her baby had not once shivered. The townsfolk came walking, not in mocking lines this time, but with hats in hand and hollowed eyes. They stood in the wet grass while Ada held the baby to her chest and watched from the threshold, not stepping out. She didn't trust her knees to hold her yet. The months had carved deep into her, left her wrists thin, her voice quiet, her sleep dreamless. The sheriff was the first to speak. "You saved them," he said, not looking up. "Most of the ones who made it through, it was cause of you." Ada said nothing. A boy behind him, a Granger maybe or one of the preacher's nephews, stepped forward and took off his coat, folded it, held it out. I want you to have this, Mrs. Grieves. You kept my cousin alive." Still Ada didn't speak, just nodded once. The boy's hands trembled. Then came the offers. Wood, cloth, a sack of barley seed, a mule someone no longer had the strength to harness, all laid gently at her door like votive gifts to a saint. But Ada didn't step forward to accept them. She remained where she was, arms wrapped around the child she'd kept warm through a winter that had stripped the valley of fathers, sons, and everything soft. When the gifts had stopped and the silence thickened, Ada finally spoke. "You should build them too." A few murmurs. One woman asked softly, "Build what?" "The sheds," Ada said, her voice cracked slightly. "Around the cabin, a second wall holds the heat, catches the wind." Silence. "Not just lumber, whatever you've got, blankets, tar, make layers and low ceilings. Don't leave air for the heat to rise out of, trap it low, and vent the smoke right, not wide." Someone cleared their throat, another nodded, someone else asked, "Will you show us?" Ada looked at the boy still holding the coat. "I'll show him." That spring something strange took root in the valley, not just green shoots or crocus flowers, but habits. New ways of building, new ways of thinking. Ada never meant to become a teacher. She'd never stood up in church to speak, never been one to lead. But when word spread, when folks from 2 valleys over came riding to ask what she'd done, it became unavoidable. They wanted to see it, to measure the shed walls, to touch the soot-soaked canvas pinned between the inner and outer layers. Some took notes, some sketched, some just stared at the 4 useless lean-tos, now turned holy relics in the eyes of a desperate frontier. A traveling man from Pier heard the tale by summer, showed up with a notepad and a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles and asked if he could draw the layout. Ada let him. He promised it would be printed in a farmer's journal. She never saw it, but a season later, a stranger rode through town and called it the Grieves method. The name stuck. By midsummer, Ada could sleep again. It wasn't easy. Her nerves still fired at every gust of wind, every pop of the stove. But she could close her eyes for hours at a time now, without fearing the baby would wake blue-lipped. The child, now crawling, chuckled freely, gnawed at dried apples, and stared at light through the cracks in the shed roof like it was magic. And people began treating Ada different. Not just with reverence, with distance. They still offered her gifts, still tipped their hats, but there was a space now, a caution, as if survival had made her something apart. She understood it, though it stung. Not many had walked through that winter with all their people alive. Ada had, but she had also buried a man, hidden a corpse in her wall, sealed herself inside her own creation. It left a mark. She didn't laugh easily anymore, didn't sit at quilting circles. She had become hard in places where softness once lived. But she wasn't bitter. Just busy. By the second autumn, the valley looked different. Every 4th cabin had a shed ring now. Not as neatly done as Ada's, not as purpose-built, but layered nonetheless. Families tore up floorboards to add stone trenches. Stoves were moved to center walls. Chimneys rerouted. The town blacksmith, who had barely survived with frostbit hands, began forging stove pipes with better caps based on Ada's sketches. No one laughed anymore. And come winter, the air smelled less of smoke and more of preparation. There was no panic when the first snows hit, only movement. And Ada, she built again. Not out of fear, out of purpose. Her new addition wasn't for insulation. It wasn't even a structure. It was a pit, a dry cellar dug beneath the south shed, lined with fieldstone and pine resin. She built it in July, sweating through her dress with the baby, now a toddler, watching from a sling on her back. She worked with a spade and pick, scraping until her hands bled. She reinforced the walls with slats from a collapsed barn 2 ridges over. This was her next line. A food store. Because it wasn't just heat that would kill. It was hunger. She filled the cellar with preserved goods before August. Salted beans, rendered fat, dried berries, cracked corn, smoked fish. She wrapped each bundle in cloth and buried the jars in straw. The cellar stayed cool, even when the August heat clung to the valley like syrup. People asked what she was building. She just said, the next shed. The second winter came sharp and sudden. A blue cold, dry and mean, with less snow but more sting. Fires didn't smoke, they hissed. Lips cracked before you could speak, and yet no one died. Not in Ada's cabin. Not in any of the ones that copied her method. The Grieves sheds, folks called them now. Some made jokes, called them prairie corsets or cozy coats. But they built them. Even the preacher added one. Even the blacksmith, who once laughed loudest, now doubled his outer walls and spoke of our values like a sermon. The town changed after that. They began to speak differently, not just of weather and crops, but of design, of airflow, of structure. The idea of holding heat became as common as talking about holding cattle. Young couples asked Ada for advice before building their first home. The blacksmith named his new forge the second wall. The valley no longer laughed at the woman who built a useless shed. They followed her. Because in the end, the warmth wasn't just in the wood or the fire. It was in what she'd done. What she'd taught them all to do. How to hold the cold back long enough to make it through one more night. One more hour. One more breath. By the third year, they no longer called it the widow's cabin. It had become something different in the minds of those who survived that first winter. A symbol, a landmark, maybe even a story they'd tell the next generation to explain how they survived the years that followed. But to Ada, it was still just home. Her home. Built once by a man she loved and rebuilt every day since by her hands alone. Every log soaked in memory. Every shed beam held the echo of fear, and breathless nights spent pacing with a swaddled infant who once whimpered like he was learning to forget the wind. The winters didn't get easier. If anything, they hardened. The third season came with a different kind of cruelty. Less snow, more ice. Thin sheets of frost that slid down from the high country and turned trees to glass and trails to death traps. But the cabins in the valley didn't break this time. Not even close. Because now they were built with that second skin, just like Ada's had been. Now they sealed their heat low and kept it trapped between walls like breath under a wool scarf. No one laughed about sheds anymore. They just built them. Ada's son, Elijah, had grown into a sturdy child, strong-limbed and fast, with hair like his father's and eyes too sharp for his age. He'd learned to walk in the outer shed, toddling between crates of supplies and the soot-darkened logs that still leaned from the first construction. Now he ran along the garden row, barefoot and howling with joy, every footstep slapping the dirt like a heartbeat. He didn't remember the first winter. Didn't remember the cold that stole the Granger baby or the whisper-quiet sobs that echoed through town after the fourth mother lost her child in a single frost-blind night. To him, the world had always had heat, and that made Ada proud and cautious. Because he would never understand what it cost. What it still cost. That year, summer brought strangers. Not vagrants, not desperates. Surveyors. Men in gray coats with measuring sticks and ledgers and boots too clean for dirt that black. They came up from the east, following rail plans and mapping towns for future connections. One had a mustache that looked painted on. Another wore wire spectacles and kept trying to sketch Ada's house from 3 angles without asking permission. Will Tanner stood near her porch, arms crossed. Ada didn't smile at the men, just asked what they wanted. The one with the spectacles replied, "We're evaluating rural settlement patterns. You might be included in a potential rail expansion. There's talk of extending a spur to connect the northern Dakota tracts." She blinked. "What does that mean for us?" "Traffic," he said simply. "Trade, growth." Ada looked out at the valley. "Trouble," she said. They left, but not without notes. Detailed drawings. Questions. One even came back with a notebook full of sketches of her cabin, asking if she would consider writing an article for a journal in Chicago. "I don't write," Ada told him. "You could dictate," he said. "You're something of a pioneer, Mrs. Grieves. Did you know there's chatter about your sheds in 3 counties now? You might be the reason several hundred people lived through last year's cold. Don't you want that story told?" She stared at him long, then shut the door. But it didn't stop the story. The blacksmith's boy made a model of her cabin for the schoolhouse. He used pine scraps and glue, even cut a tiny pipe hole in the roof. When the teacher asked him why, he said, "Because she's the one who taught us not to die." Ada never saw the model, didn't want to. But when Will brought it up, late one night as Elijah snored softly in the cot beside them, she didn't brush it off. "They're turning you into something, Ada," he said gently, rubbing calloused fingers together. "A legend, maybe." "I didn't build those sheds to be remembered," she replied. "I built them because I had a child who couldn't scream loud enough to fight the cold. That's it." Will nodded. "I know, that's why they remember." Fall turned again. The trees browned early and the air shifted. Ada's body always knew before the weather did. Her knees ached in a particular way when the freeze approached, not sharp pain, but a stiffness that grew heavy, like her bones were remembering something her mind tried to forget. She gathered supplies, reinforced the south shed wall with a second plank layer, in case the ice winds swept high again, sealed the roof joints with lye-soaked pitch, buried more jars in the stone cellar, this time with extra meat cuts, deer, rabbit, one string of dried beaver Will brought in wrapped in oilskin. The others in town did the same. There was no need for town meetings, no orders. They'd learned. They watched Ada, copied her. And when a fire broke out in the Granger home due to a stove pipe failure, no one blamed God. They blamed their insulation. And they rebuilt, this time with a double chimney pipe and a side-vented smoke route. Ada helped, quietly, without asking for thanks. That winter didn't kill anyone. That was the first in 4 years. And it changed things. Suddenly, the Grieves method was more than a story, it was a plan. People came from further. A man from Montana brought blueprints and asked to trade his grain ledger for a personal inspection. A woman from Iowa rode in with her 2 boys and asked if Ada could help her design a cabin from scratch. She wanted it done right, the way she had done it. Ada declined to travel, but she drew plans slowly, carefully, quietly. The woman left crying, not from sorrow, from thanks. In spring the town gathered. Not for church, not for mourning. For building. They tore down the old meeting hall which had warped in the thaw and raised a new one, with shed walls on all 4 sides, a roof sealed with tar canvas, and an inner vent chamber for warmth in winter gatherings. They named it after her. The Ada Grieves Community Hall. She didn't attend the dedication. Will told them she had a cough. But the truth was, she simply didn't know how to accept being celebrated for doing what no one else had done because she had to. Because no one else would have held her child at 3 a.m. and watched the frost crawl toward his lips. She hadn't been brave. She'd been cornered. And she'd built her way out. Late that summer, Elijah turned 5. The town gathered again, this time for a quiet celebration. A few toys, a pie or 2, a carved wooden horse someone had whittled. Elijah didn't understand the reverence. But Ada did. Every child in that field, laughing and running and throwing handfuls of dust, had survived a winter because she'd built a wall. And then built another. And then taught others to do the same. But not every part of the valley survived. The high ridge farms, too far, too proud, too isolated, had refused to copy the method, said they didn't need a woman's trick to beat the snow. The winter took them. 3 cabins collapsed. 7 dead. The sheriff asked Ada if she'd ride out in the fall and advised the survivors on how to rebuild. She paused, then nodded. Not for pride. For the children. When she arrived on horseback with Will and Elijah trailing behind, the ridge farms looked ghostly. Trees stripped, soil peeled raw, a few broken walls held upright only by the illusion of shape. One woman, barely 20, stood in front of a half-burned cabin, face pale as ash. She held a baby who didn't cry, just stared. That look. Ada knew it. She dismounted, walked over, asked gently, "Is there a root cellar?" The woman blinked. "No." "Then we start there." Ada didn't sleep for 3 days. She drew plans, shouted instructions, dug with her bare hands until they bled. Will worked beside her. Elijah carried rags and rocks, eager to help though barely able to lift a plank. They built a stone pit, a raised floor, and a ceiling vent. Ada showed them how to bank heat beneath the floor with dry bricks and use canvas seals to force warm air into the sleeping chamber. She taught the woman how to breathe for 2 through winter. Taught her how to fight frost with layers, not with prayers. When they left, the woman gripped her wrist so tight it hurt. "I'll call her Ada," she whispered, nodding toward her child. Ada didn't answer. She just rode down the hill and wept when no one could see her. The valley changed forever after that. Cabins no longer meant a box in the woods. They meant survival engines. They meant warmth by design, not luck. And everyone carried some echo of the woman they once mocked, who built walls not to shut the world out, but to keep one tiny, gasping life warm long enough to see another sunrise. She didn't invent the winter. She didn't end it. She just stood in it longer than anyone else, and taught the rest how to do the same. By the 5th winter, no one in the region remembered a time before the sheds. Not the children, not the new settlers who arrived from Ohio or Missouri or Kentucky, drawn by whispers of a strange little valley where folks didn't freeze anymore. New arrivals came not looking for gold or for land, but for plans, for shelter that worked, for someone who understood how to survive a winter that crept in like a killer and left your bones aching, even in July. And whether they knew her name or not, whether they'd seen her face or only heard the stories, they always ended up at the same place. Ada's cabin. By now it was hardly recognizable from the original structure Levi had built. The core logs remained, his joints and pegs untouched, his initials still faintly burned into one beam over the bed. But around them had grown something else entirely. It had become more than a shelter. It was an organism. It breathed, expanded, adapted.